Hi, this is Joseph Arthur. Thanks for checking out Come to Where I'm From. Please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/come to where I'm from. We are an independent podcast, and any contributions you can make are greatly appreciated. It's real right away.
So how about if I bring this back here? Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Good.
Yeah, you gotta be able to relax.
No, I haven't followed boxing this last period. Yeah, Ali was one of a kind.
Right.
I remember my dad and I used to watch the Friday night fights. It was on ABC.
Right, before somebody died.
We saw and I was rooting for Emil Griffith,
Uh-huh.
who was one of my favorites, fighting Benny Kid Paret, and watched him kill him on television. Right. And it definitely affects the way you look at these things.
Yeah.
Then I made the Ali exception because he was like, other than Martin Luther King, maybe like the greatest American of his time. And then, But I haven't folled boxing.
You think so? You think he was one of the greatest Americans?
Of his generation, yeah.
Yeah.
Who died on TV?
Benny Kid Paret. There used to be on ABC, this before cable, and it was just 3 networks. There was the fight of the week, and it was a big. My dad and I used to watch every week, and they'd have championship fights sometimes. And one week was, I think it was a welterweight championship. Emil Griffith and Benny Kid Paret, and Emil Griffith, I'm pretty sure was gay,
right?
But in those days, nobody. That was like a horrible thing to say about somebody.
Right, especially for a boxer.
And Benny Paret called him a faggot or something. And Griffith killed him.
Wow.
In the ring, he was just. Now, it was the refs. The ref is supposed to
stop it.
But it's hard. It's not the first or the last time that's happened.
No.
But it was the first time I ever saw it happen. It was on television. He never got up, and 2 days later, gone.
Yeah, and I think they kept airing them on TV, and then Boom Boom Mancini, I think, killed somebody or something. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, it just again. And then also cable comes along, and it gravitates first to HBO, and then now it's Extreme Fight, whatever. But it's one of those things.
Yeah, but that talks about. You wrote that book. I was just listening to some of your interviews about the Lost Chord.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in the 60s,
in
67, and how important that was to you.
Yeah.
And I guess that Ali makes me think of that because that's when he
Right, no,
went to prison.
he was a big, huge, that was the year, 1967, I wrote the book, first of all, because it was like coming up on the 50th anniversary of Summer of Love. It was published in 2017.
Right.
And I've been obsessed with the 60s for most of my life, but that seemed like the right time to do it. And it was the year I graduated from high school, so it had kind of a personal thing. But so much happened that year. And one of the things that happened that year was the year that Ali was stripped of his title because he said that he wouldn't go to Vietnam, wouldn't accept the draft, and was eventually indicted. So that was one of 15 big things that happened in 67.
Yeah. That's... Is that how you got into where you are now, you think, a product of your time?
I think it had a big influence. I was not a very good student. I always thought I was smart, but none of the teachers thought I was smart. So I did and then when marijuana came along and, records like Rubber Soul and Out of Our Heads and Highway 61 and the Vietnam protest and the whole idea of hippies, it was like I suddenly, the difference between 10th grade and 11th grade, in 10th grade I had one friend, and 11th grade I had I was part of a group of 15 or 20 people that were going to reinvent the world. So that so-called counterculture, late 60s thing, really inspired me, and certainly rock and roll was a big part of it. And then, within a couple of years, I stumbled into the music business because I found out you could make a living even if you didn't play an instrument. So, yeah, I think the 60s counterculture was a big effect on the rest of my life to this day,
Yeah, and you took acid for the first time?
I took acid in high school, yeah. I think I took it for the first time in 66, the 11th grade.
And then what music were you into? Beatles and all
I was
that?
into the famous ones, the Beatles, the Stones, Dylan. Dylan was my favorite then. He still is my favorite.
Yeah, he's my favorite too.
You know, I liked blues. You know, it was a part of being cool was to like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf,
And the Stones.
Lightnin' Hopkins. You know, because the Stones, Beatles. I like Love and Spoonful. I loved. They were one of my favorites. Rascals had some really good songs. They weren't quite as cool, but they had some great records that we would play. I just think of what we'd play at parties. Cream was huge. They only made a few records,
Right.
and Clapton, the rest of Clapton's career has been so important that people forget. But at that time, Cream was like, it was Beatles, Stones, Cream, you know.
Yeah.
In terms of every party you would go to, Disraeli Gears was playing.
Yeah. The wah wah pedal and the SG Clapton played then.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it was just amazing.
And
The
you know, I
solos
don't
were-
know anything about that guy Jack Bruce, who was the singer and the bass player, and he didn't have a big illustrious career like Clapton, but he was the lead singer of Cream,
he was
and he
killer.
had a conviction that was like exciting on
Yeah.
those records.
That's true. Great bass player too.
Had to be, you know.
Something about a 3-piece.
And then Ginger Baker invented the idea of a star drummer. There's no
Right.
John Bonham without Ginger Baker.
That's interesting. Yeah, he just passed away too, I guess.
I think he
Ginger
did, yeah,
Baker,
yeah.
Did you see that documentary? about
Incredible! Oh my goodness, what a documentary! Yeah,
it? That's
It's-
wild.
Yeah, I never met him, but that's one of the best music documentaries because it's just so raw. You know, he
And
just
the
obviously was
aftermath.
totally unfiltered. You know,
Yeah.
punched the guy, right? Who
Right.
made the documentary. Yeah.
And just the aftermath of a music career, and then, like, you know, even if it's successful, what that maybe does to your ego and twists you up in kind of different ways. It's hard to survive this kind of thing, I think, in a way that's healthy.
Well, it has an effect on people. I mean, I my guess is he was pretty wacky before he was in Cream. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think being successful makes you that way.
No.
It can distort. I mean, it's part of the thing about being successful. You know, I think about this a lot, obviously, with the people I've worked with, and some of them aren't here anymore. Part of it is it magnifies like certain madness, but it also, if your whole thing is I want to be successful,
Yeah.
and that'll make me happy, and then you get all the success and you're
Yeah.
still unhappy, like now what do I do?
Yeah.
You know, now what's the drug? You know, I tried all the physical drugs. Now the drug of success, the most elusive thing. I got the brass ring, and I don't feel that much better when I go to bed or wake up.
Right.
That's also a thing. You know, it's that like that old corny Peggy Lee song. Is that all there is?
Right.
You know.
I don't know the song, but yeah, I relate to the song.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm quite lucky in that way that success has eluded me because it's made me dive deep into other things that have brought me, you know, I mean, like I do a regular yoga practice and
Yeah.
all this kind of stuff. And that does give you a satisfaction on a daily basis if you remain disciplined.
Totally. It's,
You know?
it's huge to not just identify with whatever scorecard it is. of
Yeah.
How much money do you have? What parties you invited to? How famous are you? Or,
Right.
you know, but if you could define yourself as a soul and not just, as Ram Dass says, you know, one of my, as
Yeah.
in terms of your soul and not in terms of your role, better long-term strategy for not hating yourself.
That's right. And that's the thing about you. You're kind of an interesting conglomeration of things, you know, like you're also are you still a Buddhist?
I never was a Buddhist.
Or not a Buddhist, but
you know, I was inspired because of psychedelics,
Right.
And the feeling that there's something bigger than this physical body and this linear reality.
Yeah.
You know, and then around the time I was doing psychedelics was around the time that George Harrison started writing and
Maharishi.
singing and talking about Hindu traditions, which was his, you know, first they were into the Maharishi and then later the Krishna consciousness guy, Swami Bhaktivedanta. And then a couple of years later, Ram Dass published that book. I mean, Richard Alpert was one of the popularizers, along with Tim Leary, of LSD in the 60s. They were both Harvard professors.
Richard Alpert, that's a Ram Dass.
And then
isn't it?
Richard Alpert goes to India, changes his name to Ram Dass,
Okay, yeah.
and writes this book called Be Here Now,
Right,
which is published in 1970. And by that time, I'd completely stopped taking drugs. I got in trouble by the time I was 18 and like just stopped everything because I didn't want to like self-destruct.
How'd you get into trouble? Wow.
I was stoned, and in my pocket were Secanols, methadone, needles, and a 38 Derringer.
Holy shit!
And,
you
and
were
I went, no, dude.
You forget something, or there's
you were
more?
getting into it.
Dude.
I didn't realize that. I thought you took a little acid, smoked a bit of weed, thought you were out there, and that was
and
the end.
I was in Berkeley, somewhere near Berkeley, might have been Oakland, in Northern California, and I asked the cop for directions.
Holy shit!
Which was, you think I wanted to get caught? Possibly.
Yeah, like if you psychoanalyzed it.
Yeah, so I spent I was 17. I was lucky. It was
Wow.
just 6 weeks before my 18th birthday. So I spent 5 days in Alameda County Juvenile Hall, and nothing horrible happened. No one raped me. No one beat me up. But boy, I never wanted to be in that situation again.
Yeah, fuck that.
I was like, I'd never want to have to ask permission to go to the bathroom or like feel this way. So it made me question what is this all about? And there's some kind of, I had to go to this group therapy thing as a condition of my release, and I'm not a huge therapy guy, but that 6 months when I had to do that, it did help me. I realized other people had problems.
Right.
It wasn't only me. I was like, so surprised.
That's the best thing about AA.
Yeah.
Is you go in there and it's like, oh, this is the human condition.
Right.
This is what it's about.
Yeah.
Everyone's dealing.
So I didn't, once I fulfilled my obligation, I didn't do, since then I've been, I wouldn't say I'm 100%. I mean, especially with this legal cannabis era, but I've been very, for decades, I don't even think I had a glass of wine. And then the last 10 years, I've loosened up slightly, but I never got out of control on any kind of drugs or anything like that after that, because I was just, it was the scared straight cliche worked for me.
You scared yourself straight.
So, but I still remembered that psychedelic feeling and cherished it. I don't regret at all the psychedelics. I regret some of the other stuff. So when I read Ram Dass's book, where he made the link between his psychedelic experiences, which were vast, and his decision that, like, as he said, the problem was I kept coming down. And then meeting his guru and everything like that. So that book, Be Here Now, is kind of like a menu. It tells his personal story, but then he gives like kind of a dozen different spiritual books to read and different ideas. You don't have to be a member of one organization. I never joined up with an organization or anything like that. I just like the idea that there's many different paths to the same thing. And I did kind of like the devotional Hindu lane a little better for me personally than the Buddhist one. I have friends that are Buddhists. It's the same thing. It's one truth.
Right.
But I identify more with kind of what they call the bhakti devotional side of Hinduism than with Buddhism.
Buddhism's
a little abstract for me.
Hinduism's more of a party.
I like Krishna. I remember I was in Central Park once around after my drug period, but maybe before I read Ram Dass's book, and the Krishna people were there, and they were dancing around. They had these horrible haircuts, this stupid top knot, and the rest of their head shaved, dancing around like I thought idiots, and they scared me because they felt culty to me, and I was never wanted to be in a cult. I was like, that was one promise I made to myself. But there was also a sweetness about them.
Yeah.
And so this guy gave me a picture of, and it said on the picture, it said, if you just say the word Krishna once with love, then for the rest of your life, you're cool. And I said to myself, that's a pretty good deal.
Right. I can do it.
Let me try this.
Yeah.
And for all I know, that changed the rest of my life.
Yeah.
It certainly didn't hurt.
Right. No, I agree with you there.
I didn't join up I didn't become a quote-unquote Krishna person because I didn't like organizations. It seemed incompatible with the idea of spirituality to me.
Yeah.
Which is to go beyond form and structure to suddenly join up where you have to do what somebody else is telling you. That never was my thing. But the idea of tuning into a more cosmic version of reality continues to... The older I get, the more it works. The
more you need it.
The more you need it.
I mean, that's what I found. That's why I do the yoga every single day.
Same thing. Yoga is part of the Hindu cosmology.
In.
Yeah, it's part of the same thing.
Yeah. What were you doing with the gun?
You know, I went out to Berkeley. I enrolled in the University of California at Berkeley because I had mediocre grades but good SATs. And in those days, if you had SATs over a certain number, you automatically got into Berkeley. And Berkeley had this kind of cool reputation. There'd been protests there, and it was far away from New York, as far away as I could get from my parents, and still, you know. So I mean, I love my parents. I miss them. I wish they were still alive. But at that time, I didn't want them in my head.
You're individuating.
Yeah, like I'm individuating.
That's
like,
healthy.
Precisely. Yeah. So I keep reminding myself of that relative to my kids who are now in their 20s.
And individuating. Yeah.
But you know, believe me, they're nicer to me than I was to my parents.
Yeah.
But and so me and a pal of mine from high school shared an apartment. You didn't have to live in the dorms. And we were right next door to these guys that were like Vietnam vets and bikers. And they had great drugs. And they were great guys. And none of them were Jewish. They weren't intellectual. They were a totally different kind of person. But like we had rock and roll and drugs in common. We go to the Fillmore, this and that. And they all had guns. So they said, "Oh man, New York." They used to call me New York.
Yeah.
I had a nigga, New York. You got to get a gun. Come on. I said, "Man, now we'll get you a cute little gun. It's good. We all have guns. You got to have a gun." So I never used it.
Right, you just had one.
I just had one because I was hanging out with
that
a
was
bunch.
the thing to do.
Yeah.
Did you know how to use it, or is just
Well, you pull back the thing and you pull the trigger.
trigger.
One time I shot a thing into the wall of an apartment just to do it once. You know, before we let.
Could have gone outside, I guess.
You know,
Into
we were
a
high.
tree,
We were high.
killed the guy next door?
No, it was nobody next door. It
So-
was ridiculous. It was.
Yeah,
Right.
That's why.
Well, you were
why
18, not even.
I was 17.
17, yeah. So when did you figure out, oh, I could do something in the music business that would be a career, or I could make some money here? And what was that thing? It was publicity, right?
Well, it went in a few stages. The first thing that happened was I come back to New York because of the trouble I got into in California
so
that I
that
mentioned earlier.
fate
I'm
brought
staying
you
in
back
my
to New York.
parents' apartment in Westchester, going to this therapy thing, and I wanted to get my own apartment. So I looked in the New York Times. Of course, in those days, they had classified ads, help wanted, and most of the jobs said key punch operator. That was like the equivalent of being a
making keys,
writing code. No, it was the early pre-computer. Key punch operator was the predecessor to being like a code writer. And I remember I did an interview for one of those jobs for Sears Roebuck, and you had to pass a written test. The guy said, and he said, okay, you could start. And then there was another ad that said magazine. Clerk wanted for magazine. So I had written for the high school newspaper, and in my mind, I was a writer. And I liked the word magazine. And the magazine turned out to be Billboard. And I didn't know what Billboard was. There was no publicity then about the music business. I didn't know what record companies were. I just thought they were artists and me and my friends, and you'd go to the store. I didn't know there was a whole business connected to it until I saw this magazine, Billboard. And it's a whole magazine that was published every week just about this business that I didn't even know existed. And I got that job, and it was a job in what they called the chart department, which was that in those days, the way they compiled the charts, they had 8 of us in a room at desks calling stores all day long for 4 days a week. And then on the 5th day, it would all be compiled, and they would announce the charts. So you'd have a checklist of singles and say, okay, are they selling heavy, medium, or light? So Janis, Big Brother's Piece of My Heart was out then. So that was like my favorite. So I would say heavy, even if it wasn't really
That's
heavy.
what I was about to say. This would be easy to fake.
Yeah. Oh,
Like,
no.
This would be easy to influence.
Yeah, no, I influenced it, but not corruptly. Nobody paid me off. I just said, cool, I love Janis Joplin.
You did it from a soul
I love
level.
Janis Joplin, soul level.
Soul level corruption.
And
That's a
so,
song.
and then that was like October, I think, of '68. Then in December, the second week of December, this guy walks into the chart department. What happened is the promo guys, the guys that would work the records at radio stations, would come and schmooze the chart department just in case they would have any influence, and they would tell their client, oh yeah, we visited Billboard. It was like part of the ritual. Come and shake. How you doing? How you doing?
Yeah.
And these promo guys were like Martians to me. They would wear these leisure suits. They would have like long hair, but it was coiffed. They didn't know it was like half mafia, half hippie fashion that only was for promo guys. They just looked like people. I didn't even know if they were even the same species.
They must have tried to give you drugs
But-
and shit like that.
But one thing, Lou Selener, I remember the guy's name, was at Capitol Records, and he gave everybody in the department a free copy of the Beatles' White Album the day it came out. And that was the day I said, I like this. You know, that was like gold. There's no free music. There's no Spotify or YouTube. That was like cash.
No, I remember when I got my first record deal, went into the company and got all the free CDs. Same thing. It was like, what the fuck?
Yeah. So I just said to myself, I gotta stay involved with this thing.
Yeah.
And I say the same thing to myself every day for 50 years. I gotta stay in this. This is good.
Right.
I don't know how I got here, but I like this. Then by the next month, I noticed I'm getting to know the other people in the office and seeing who else works there. And there were these other people, and one of the guys had long hair. He wasn't that much older than me, who got to go to shows for free, and all he had to do was write his opinion of the show.
Right.
That's it.
And I said, I could do that. I may
like-
have low self-esteem. My English teacher may have thought I didn't write a good essay. I could go to the Fillmore and say what I think of Savoy Brown. You know, I could do that. So I kept nagging them, and what happened is when one of the regular writers couldn't cover a show, they would let me do it, and I got paid extra. I was paid 30 cents an inch for each inch of print that was published, not each that I wrote, but what they ended up publishing. So I'd make an extra $15-20 that week, and the first one came out and it said, by Daniel Goldberg, and that was like I existed.
Right.
I had a buy, like I could call people, and and then this was early '69, and then in the summer of '69. Nobody wanted to go to Woodstock. All the older writers, the old guys, they were like 35. To me, that was like 100.
Yeah, of course. I was dead.
And they were in a totally different cultural universe. They hated all the rock stuff. They liked to go like to the Copacabana. Their idea of a good assignment was where you got free drinks and free dinner.
Yeah.
So Woodstock appealed to none of the real A-list writers.
Amazing.
So the editor came to me and said, "Look, no one wants to go. Do you want to go?" I said, "Yeah, I'm cool. I'll go."
Yeah.
So I wrote
guess.
There's drugs.
So I wrote I was non-druggy then, but I loved the music. It was Jimi Hendrix, and
It's unreal.
It was
Did you see Hendrix
Woodstock.
there?
I didn't. I
he
fell
went
asleep.
on at like 4 in the
I
morning
was
or some
asleep.
shit.
I was
like that,
asleep. I saw him in the movie.
Yeah.
I didn't, but I saw.
Right.
So that was August of '69, and. Just this last August, I wrote an article 50 years later. It's just incredible. Those experiences
how
for the
valuable
whole
that
rest
is.
of my life are part of what we would today call my brand, just because I was there. So that was sort of it. I started as a quote, and then I was like, got to know there was this community of 50 or 60 people who wrote about rock and roll.
Yeah.
And, New York Times had somebody. There were a lot of magazines in those days, Changes and Fusion, and Cream was just starting, and the Rolling Stone writers and different people. And we all went to the same, every night there was like a press party. The record business was booming, so you never had to buy a meal. You'd go to these parties, you'd get the free food, you'd see the band, you'd see friends, you'd try to pick people up. That was my life, I found a life suddenly,
Big one.
And again, that's still kind of to this day is an extension of those periods of time. But after a period of a couple of years, it was obvious to me I couldn't make a living as a writer. I wasn't really disciplined enough or good enough.
Well, 30 cents an inch or whatever that was. Or
Well,
what'd you
then
say,
I left.
15?
Well, no, I had a series of different jobs.
It's hard to make rent with that.
No. Then I had a full-time job at Record
that
World.
was on top of it.
Then Record World, the competing magazine, hired me, and I was a full-time writer. I didn't have to be in the chart department anymore, and that was a salary. I forget what it was, $200 a week, which is like $1,000 a week today or something.
Yeah.
And then I worked for Circus magazine for a year. So I had a series of jobs where I was, but I hit a brick wall in terms of my writing career, and so I became a publicist.
So you were unafraid to adapt. That's one of the things.
Well, I was afraid of being broke and having to ask my parents for money.
That fear served you well, though.
So that's I would say that was the main motivator.
Yeah.
But it served me well, yeah.
That has served you well. Because you once told me that you write your books when you get that fear comes over you.
Totally.
And you start writing a book.
Yeah,
I've always remembered that.
Oh, far out.
Yeah, that is something I keep in my mind. 'Cause
Yeah.
I'm like, when I get afraid, I'm like, I should be like Danny and write a book.
Well, you do all the other, you paint.
I know, but that fear serving me too.
You do. So you have more talents than I have.
Well,
That's the only thing I can do. You
we'll
can
see.
paint, you can sing, you can write music,
Yeah.
podcaster,
But so then you switch to publicity, or how do you make that leap?
Well, I needed a job. To me, originally, it was always like I looked down on publicists because we were writers, but then I couldn't make. Then after Circus went under, I wanted to make some money. I got Circus, which was my previous job. They were a great magazine, and their archive is somewhere. But they were the only rock magazine that had color pictures in those days. And a lot of good writers wrote for them. Paul Nelson and a lot of people that were also Rolling Stone writers would also write for Circus. But they hit financial problems and they closed down for a period of time. I lost my job there, and I couldn't get another writing job. And I was running out of money, so I begged all my friends, "Do you know of a job? Do you know of a job? Do you know of a job?" And I was recommended for a job at a PR company called Salters and Roskin. Mm-hmm. And Lee Salters was an old school PR guy. Again, to me, he looked like 100 years old. He was probably 50 or 60,
right?
And he wanted a long-haired guy who knew the rock press people. But their clients were like Frank Sinatra, Barbra Streisand, Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, 10 Broadway plays, Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Those kind of clients. And they wanted somebody for this new growth area, rock and roll. And so I interviewed for him and he hired me at the beginning of 1973,
right.
I learned how to be a publicist from him. We were different culturally, different generations. I don't think we had anything in common, but he was my boss, and he was a nice guy. I thought he was going to be like kind of a jerk, and he could be a jerk, but he taught me what it was to be a publicist and what the craftsmanship of it and the discipline of it. Because my idea was, I asked my friends for favors. That's what a publicist does.
Yeah.
But what he explained to me in his own way, I'm paraphrasing, was, you only have a limited number of favors, but if you come up with a good story, you don't have to ask for a favor.
It's about storytelling.
Yeah, it's about storytelling. It's about that first, and he said the most important thing in a press release is the first paragraph.
Yeah.
And the most important thing in the first paragraph is the first sentence.
Right.
And as obvious as that sounds, it was really, I still explain that to people to this day about just communicating ideas and the craftsmanship and the work ethic.
Especially nowadays with the attention spans, you got to grab them fast.
Yeah, but even then the attention spans were not so great. When if you're an editor somewhere at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and you're getting in 50 press releases, you're going through them pretty quickly.
Right.
So that was in January of 73, and then in March or April, quite soon thereafter, maybe 3 months later, but I've had these 3 months of being in kind of the boot camp of the Salters and Roskin approach to publicity. He said, "Do we want this band Led Zeppelin?" Mm-hmm. So I said, "Yeah, they're one of the biggest bands." He says, "Well, you better come with me to the meeting because I don't understand anything about that music."
Was there other rock bands on the roster, or was Zeppelin the first one?
I think Zeppelin was the first. We had when I first got there, the first client he assigned me to work on was a jazz trumpeter named Stan Getz.
Yeah, well, he's amazing.
He was amazing, yeah. So I did publicity for Stan Getz, but it was just a 1 month thing. And then there was like Paul Anka, and there was a series of they throw me excess normal music clients. I don't.
Did you work with Sinatra?
No.
Okay.
No. That was not high enough in the pecking order to work with Sinatra. No, I got Stan Getz, Paul Anka. I can't remember 2 or 3 other things. They'd throw me. Sometimes it'd be a movie. and the movie guy was overloaded. So could you do Rip Torn's doing an interview at the Chelsea for some new movie? Could
You
you
work
go
with
there?
Rip Torn?
I went once. I met him once.
He's amazing.
You know, my job was to pay for the
Rest in
drinks.
peace. Yeah.
That was while he did the interview, which I was more than happy to do.
That's fine.
You know, so they just throw me whatever. I was the low man on the totem pole. But then for Zeppelin, he knew I was the only one that. So we flew to Paris. I'd never been to Europe.
Yeah.
You know, with him. To
How old are you here?
22.
It's incredible.
Jesus.
You're like Zelig. Has anybody ever told you that before?
I've heard it before.
You've got to have heard that
Yeah.
before. That's like, you know that Woody Allen movie, Zelig?
Oh,
it's
you've
like,
never seen Zelig?
Oh, it's incredible.
It's such a good movie.
He's just everywhere in history that's relevant. This guy's like that in the music business. It's unbelievable.
So I actually haven't seen Zelig for a long time. I
Yeah.
might watch it again over
Yeah,
the
it's
weekend.
time to rewatch it.
Yeah, time to rewatch
Yeah.
it. It was.
So you're going to Europe.
So we go to Paris,
Right.
and stayed at the Georges V Hotel because that's where Zeppelin was staying.
They were already pretty famous.
They were huge.
They were huge.
No, they were at their peak.
Okay.
The previous album that they had made at the time I met them, their most recent album, was
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin 4.
Wow, so they were
which
huge.
had Stairway to Heaven on it.
Yeah.
So they were at their apex. And
but they were, just to like let people know, the reason they were trying to hire the publicity department is because they were getting ravaged by the critics still, right?
Well, what
that part of
happened
it?
with Zeppelin is that their first album came out in '69, I think. And I was actually at Billboard when their album came up, and they happened to walk into the chart department and say, "Hi, we're Led Zeppelin." I didn't talk to them. I was just, "Hello," you know.
Right.
And that was like this weird thing. And what's Led Zeppelin? And then like a month later, it's like boom, you know, good times, bad times, and all that sort of thing. So the rock press was made up of people of a certain age, mostly mid-20s. I was like, say, people 5 years older than me were sort of the taste makers, the Rolling Stone in particular writers. But it wasn't only Rolling Stone, but they epitomized it. And they all loved, you know, the Cream and the blues and the earlier, you know, the Stones. And Zeppelin comes along, number one, as sort of being looked at as derivative, believe it or not, of Cream, even though they far outshone Cream ultimately musically. And secondly, by '69, FM radio had blossomed into this very powerful thing for the American rock audience. Earlier, in '67, there was no... Rock radio starts in '67. There was no such thing as an FM radio station that played rock and roll until '67. It was started in San Francisco by a guy named Tom Donahue. It got great ratings right away. And then by '68, by '69, there's no city, medium or big, in North America that doesn't have an FM station playing
like
rock and roll. And it became later, it was called AOR, rock radio.
Right.
In the beginning, it was called underground radio, believe it or not. And so Zeppelin...
AOR, album-oriented radio.
Yeah, that becomes the jargon by the mid-'70s. But in '69, it's just called underground radio.
Right.
And they came out exactly the right time. There was a guy at Atlantic named Mario Medius, whose nickname was the Big M, who Atlantic hired one guy.
The Big M. Get the Big M.
Yeah, he was the first guy to ever do promotion at rock radio. And part of the mystique of Atlantic was the Big M. African-American guy who promoted rock and roll. And I interviewed him for one of my books about, I met him later, but I didn't know him then. I said, "So what happened?" He says, "Man, you know, I went to WBCN in Boston, and they all hated Led Zeppelin because they liked the real blues. They liked Sonny Boy Williamson and all this stuff. And I explained to them, I am the blues.
Right.
They were all these white boys. I'm told them that this is real." And J.J. Jackson, who was one of the few black DJs on rock radio, first guy to play Led Zeppelin, and boom, they played it once, and the phones go crazy. So within like 2 weeks, you know, Led Zeppelin's first album is like one of the best-selling albums in the country, and the rock critics had nothing to do with it.
Right.
Zero.
So they went in.
So they hated it, both generationally, because suddenly they were a little older. You know, when you're 25... you're a lot older than a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
You know, you're not young. Now you're the next generation. It's a shock
It is.
to not be that cutting edge anymore. It happens really quickly.
It does.
You know,
You blink and it's gone.
you blink and it's gone.
Yeah.
And so they decided. So all the reviews were bad, and the same thing happened in England for other cultural reasons I don't understand. The press for same psychological reasons.
Could be jealousy. 'Cause
So it was
Zeppelin
jealousy.
so amazing. That
It was
maybe
jealousy, and they hadn't discovered it. It was
Right.
like
It wasn't theirs.
you know, and it wasn't theirs. And the fans were younger, and they were like not into feeling old when you're 25. That's like, what is that all about? So for whatever reason, they got bad press, and so Jimmy Page, who was the first among equals in Zeppelin, and Peter Grant, their manager, decided, fuck the press. We just won't fucking talk to them. So for several years, they hardly ever did any interviews, would be rude to the press, wouldn't give them backstage passes, were tough about giving anybody photo passes. They were like the rebels. Then a few years passed. They've become commercially, literally the biggest rock band in the world. Their concert attendance and their record sales are now bigger than the Stones.
Wow.
And Robert Plant told me, because later on, after I was writing, I said, "Why did you decide?" He says, "You know, I was tired of my parents not knowing I was successful."
Right.
You know, and
Because they would just read it.
They
and
would just read,
like,
you know.
This is a
he
joke.
Says, and then I saw and then he says, and then I saw the Stones on the cover of Newsweek, and that was just so ridiculous. I knew we were so for whatever it was. I don't know if it was just Robert, but the band decides let's get a publicist. And lucky for me, they reach out to a company that had hired me as the rock guy. We go to the meeting. So I'm on the plane with Lee, and he says, "Well, tell me about the Zeppelin. Tell me about the Zeppelin." I says, "Well, look, the writers in America don't like them. They consider them almost barbarians. There was a story about them like pushing around a female journalist who wrote about them as being very uncouth, you know, grabbing her breasts or something like that." And he says, like, so we get to the meeting with Peter. So we get there, and we're supposed to meet first with their manager, Peter Grant. Peter Grant was a former professional wrestler.
Scary dude.
Physically intimidating,
That's when you wish you had your
300-pound
gun again.
300-pound guy who knew a lot of British gangsters, and people were scared of him. Intimidating dude. And we go in and meet with him, and Lee says, tell Peter about what you said. Tell Peter about you said the barbarians thing. I said, oh, well, you know, I talked to some of my writer friends, and, you know, they came up with, you know, they're worried like that the band is like barbarians. And Peter gave me this big grin. He had these capped teeth, these shiny white teeth, big grin. And he says, yeah, but, and I can't do a Cockney accent.
Right.
He says, yeah, but we're just mild barbarians. You know?
Good band name, the Mild Barbarians.
So, you know, the next day I met with the band, and then we were the publicists, and then you know, they start the tour. Houses of the Holy was the album. Comes out. Rolling Stone gives it another terrible review. One of the great Zeppelin albums to me is Houses of the Holy.
Masterpiece.
Incredible how that holds up.
It's unbelievable.
And they write Led Zeppelin.
Great album cover too.
Yeah. Led Zeppelin, Limp Blimp. That's Rolling Stones. They're
Unreal.
still down. So
Shout out Rolling Stones.
So I'm trying to. So I had to figure. So I the only thing I could think of is an angle, because Lee Salters told me this word, angle. You need an angle. If you're going to go to the press, you have to give them an angle.
A story.
An angle. What's the? So the only angle I could think of wasn't that I could never convince the critics that they were good, but I convinced the editors that they were big.
Right. They're
and that
relevant.
You've got to cover this.
Yeah.
And the first show they did on the American tour when I was the publicist, again, just luck, was Atlanta Stadium, 50,000 people. No one else on the bill, just Led Zeppelin. They didn't have an opening act. They played 2.5 hours.
Crazy.
And I'm with Lee, and he says, did you call this one? Did you call that one? I said, yeah, Lee, I called everybody. He says, what about the wire services? And I'm like a deer in the headlights, like, what? AP and UPI. And he looks so exasperated at me. Okay. You know, I had never thought of that, you know, to call the Associated Press and the UPI. Wire services were these services that for all there were 1,000 newspapers in America, and they couldn't all hire a music writer.
Right.
So 900 of them would get their stories from these services, the Associated Press and UPI. I think AP still exists. You'll see Associated Press on stories.
They do.
So And the second show was in Tampa, Florida, and that was 56,800 people. So I used to carry around a portable typewriter with me and paper. I put it in my suitcase. And so after Tampa, the second show, I write up this press release, because the Beatles, when they headlined Shea Stadium, it was 55,000 some people, because that's what Shea Stadium held.
Mm-hmm.
And Zeppelin, the Tampa Stadium was 56.8. So I say, breaks Beatles record, for biggest audience of a single artist.
That's your angle,
That's
ladies
my
and
angle.
gentlemen. That's the angle.
And
that's something they can run with.
And I got a cab to the UPI office, and the guy's there by himself. It's Tampa UPI stringer, not a big job.
Right.
And, okay, thanks. And, put it on the wire. And, years later, when Zeppelin did their very last Zeppelin show was in London. It was a reunion for some charity.
When was that?
What?
What year?
5 years ago.
Yeah.
10, I forget when.
Oh,
I know I went with Pele from the Hives. So it was while I was having this company. But sometime in the last decade, after not having anything for years, they did a little movie they put together about Zeppelin that they showed, because it was literally the last Led Zeppelin show, maybe the last one that there ever will be. And they were nice enough to let me go to it. And in the film, like they show a close-up of that newspaper,
headline.
breaks Beatles record.
Right.
First time I knew because they never would say that was great or good job or nothing.
But they could say that.
But 50 years later, I said, okay, I guess they dug that,
Yeah.
So then we were off to the races.
I see. They would never say to you, "Great job."
No.
Why not?
It wasn't the culture.
Wasn't the thing. Yeah.
It was. Look, Robert was always nice to me, and to this day, I just saw him a few months ago in a festival in San Francisco. He's the nicest guy.
Yeah, he's aged well.
Yeah,
like
he was
this
nice
business.
then. He's nice now. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it, but it was a lot of cocaine. I was not on. I was straight guy.
They were
then.
gods.
They were gods. Their part of the culture was to look down on the business,
right?
To look down on the idea of
Robert
would say to me, "Okay, what else do you want me to do?" And I'd say, "Robert, I work for you. It's whatever you don't want me to set up interviews. I want to set up interviews." But he wanted to pretend I was forcing him to do them.
That's his angle.
Because he didn't want to look at himself as a guy that liked doing interviews, even though he was.
Right.
He was great at doing interviews.
That held through all the way through the 90s and only shifted recently now, where I think musicians are more like, we're all businessmen, and like that's like what we're supposed to be ambitious. Like that's cool now.
Yeah.
To start a podcast is cool now.
Yeah,
but in the 90s, that would be like... But I heard you were right behind Bob Gruen when he took that famous photo of them on the Zeppelin plane, like the Zeppelin plane photo.
I'm sure I was there. I'm sure I called him. That was my job, was to call photographers and journalists to get pictures. Sure, I'm sure I was there. Yeah.
Yeah,
I was their publicist. That's how anyone would know where to go, is because I would send them a release saying.
But did they have publicists in the UK? You were their first ever publicist.
I just did it in the U.S. I was the American guy. I didn't do the rest of the world for them. I don't know exactly what they did in the U.K. There was a period of time where there was a guy named B.P. Fallon, who was kind of a legendary character in England. He was also close to Mark Bolan. Did press for them for a while. Annie Ivell at Atlantic was a British woman who would sometimes do press for them in the UK, but my job was strictly the United States.
So how long did you work in publicity, and how did you then go into the music business to ultimately become like a head of a record company and all that?
Well, it took a long time, obviously.
Yeah.
I worked for Salters. After 1 year at Salters and Roskin, Zeppelin hired me to work full-time for them, because I didn't even know if they liked me after that tour. And then Peter... I got called by their lawyer. Would you meet with Peter? Would you fly over to England, meet with Peter? He wants to talk to you about something. Like, okay. And he offered me this job. He says, Jimmy and I really appreciate what you did, and do you want to work for us? I said, cool. So I got a raise. I was making $15,000 a year at Salters and Roskin, and Zeppelin paid me $25,000 a year. That was a big increase.
That's a huge leap.
And plus, I just thought, I got to take this shot. The biggest band in the world. So I went to work for them. I worked for them for about 3 years. Then I
just publicity still, or did
no?
You do
well, then Peter says, "Would you want to be our head of publicity?" So I said, I think I'd be taken more seriously if I had a broader title. He says, well, what title do you want? I said, how about just vice president of Swan Song? He said, fine.
Wow.
Nobody worked there. He was president.
Right.
They owned it. He's fine. Be
What
vice
was
president.
Swan
Swan Song
was their label.
Was the
Their own
label
label?
that Led Zeppelin created. In those days, the Beatles had created Apple. Rolling Stones had Rolling Stones Records. So if you were a superstar band, Jefferson Airplane had their own label called Grunt Records. So Zeppelin it was like a badge of superstardom to have your own label. And
What gave you the wherewithal to make that, proposition to him? Like, where do
I
you
have
think
no
where
idea.
do you think that comes from?
I don't know. I have
You
no
don't
idea.
you don't know where that inspiration came from, because I think that's like something that would like separate the. I mean, this sounds. I hate that I'm wording it this way. The men from the boys. I hate wording it that way, but that's what's coming into my head, and I can't think of another way to put it. But like, I think that's a key to your rise in this whole career.
I don't know where I got it from.
I want to
Maybe-
know where you got that.
I don't know whether it was from my parents,
Right.
who did love me. They were very disappointed that I dropped out of college and terrified when I got into problem with drugs. But they did always tell me I was smart.
Were they digging this vibe?
It took them a while. They didn't understand
when you're
it.
vice president of Swan
They
Song?
didn't. My
No,
mother,
still
when
not.
I got the job, my mother says, "You sure you don't want to just go back to college?"
Right.
No, I swear to God. No, and I said, Mother, I know you don't know who Led Zeppelin is, but please believe
Right.
me.
I'm
This is-
crushing it at life.
Oh my god.
I'm seriously crushing it right now.
And it was only maybe till the end of the 70s, till I was almost 30, like
Yeah.
around 79 or 80, my parents got it that I had
Yeah.
actually found a career. It's not their fault. They never heard of such a
Right.
thing. What is this rock and roll?
Yeah.
But then the missing link, and then I had this other insane confidence based on when I was to take a step back. After Billboard, I got a job at Record World. Record World was a competing weekly trade magazine to Billboard, but at Record World, I could be a full-time writer, not in the chart department. So I had that job for about a year, and one of the first things I did when I was there was that, and then I could pick any assignment I wanted. I was like, I had far more choices of what to write about, far more space in each
You had some
issue to
power
write about.
there.
I had a column. I review things, And so within the first month or so, there was an MC5 concert at, there was a venue called the Pavilion in Queens. It had been part of the 1964 World's Fair, and they didn't disassemble it, and they would do concerts there in the summer. It's like an outdoor venue. And I knew that all of the rock writers that I thought were cool, the Rolling Stone writers and people like that, the Village Voice writers were very idealized
Hip.
in my head. They all loved the MC5. The MC5 were revolutionary. They were cool. They were hip. So I knew before I even saw them, I was going to write how great they were because I wanted to be cool. I mean, that was
Right.
more important to me than being a critic.
Right.
And so, I write this column saying how great they are. And it comes out on Monday. And the next day I get a call from Danny Fields.
Uh-huh.
Danny Fields was somebody who I had read about. There had been an article just about him in a little magazine, and I had read about him. And Danny Fields, when he worked at Elektra Records, on his business card, his title was Company Freak. That was actually a job.
Right.
That Elektra, when they signed the Doors, who had been a folk label, realized they needed somebody who could relate to these freaks, the acid heads. They had Love, Arthur Lee's band Love. They had Doors, which became their biggest band. And Danny Fields had convinced them to sign the MC5. And he also convinced them to sign the Stooges. Legendary character. I'm sure you must have run into Danny Fields over the years. He later on, what he's best known for is that he discovered and managed the Ramones
Right.
in the early part of their career. And that song Danny Says is about Danny Fields. And there's a
Okay.
documentary about Danny Fields called Danny Says.
Okay. And I've seen that. And he discovered Iggy Pop too, basically.
He
right?
signed Iggy Pop and the MC5. So
Yeah.
at this time, he had moved over to Atlantic because Elektra fired him because the MC5 pissed them off. It's not worth going through the whole
Oh,
story.
really?
Yeah. And so he gets hired by Atlantic, and brings the MC5 to Atlantic after that, because Elektra dropped the MC5. The MC5 like insulted some retail chain and said fuck them, and Elektra didn't want to be in trouble with the retail chain, so they just dropped it. And the MC5 never made any money for any record company.
Right.
They were influential culturally,
Right.
but no one ever made a
They
dime.
added legitimacy.
No one ever made a dime with the MC5.
Yeah.
So they didn't have the clout of a Zeppelin or a big commercial band.
But they were cool.
They were cool. So Danny got Atlantic to sign them. So he took me to lunch, and I was just so in awe of him. I mean, he knew Jim Morrison and Judy Collins and Andy Warhol and all that stuff. And he invited me to go with him later that week to Max's Kansas City. And to walk into Max's Kansas City with Danny Fields, you know, Max's Kansas City, there's also a documentary about it. I don't know if it's come out, but there's books about it. Max's Kansas City was a club on Park Avenue and 18th Street that was a famous cultural hangout for Warhol, a lot of his so-called superstars, Lou Reed. And it was a mixing ground. You'd see Jackie Kennedy might be there, Janis Joplin, you know, all different cultural things kind of would meet there. And Mickey Ruskin was the guy who owned Max's. And one of his famous things, if anyone came up to Max's in a limo, they were not allowed in.
Really?
You know, that was his thing. He was cool. And he would get all these painters that were, I don't know painting. You would know these names. But the people who couldn't pay their bar take, they'd pay him with a painting.
Oh, right.
And so when you walked in at the bar,
De
there were these
Kooning
paintings that
and
were
all
worth
those
like
guys.
millions of dollars.
Yeah.
You know. So the fact that I walked in with, and there was a back room. The back room of Max's was like the cool place to be. That's where when Warhol would go. And so Danny, the first night I went there, invited other people to meet me. I was this 19-year-old new face.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing. But and a woman named Gloria Stavers was there, who was the editor of 16 magazine, and she was had been one of Lenny Bruce's lovers, and also had had affairs earlier in her life with like Jim Morrison and Mickey Mantle, like amazing, larger than life former model. Died tragically young in her late 50s of lung cancer. Was a great mentor to me. She was the one who recommended me for the Saltish job with Zeppelin, and Lillian Roxon, who passed away in the early 70s, who's an Australian journalist who covered America for the Sydney Morning Herald, this character, and Steve Paul, who had a club named Steve Paul's The Scene, where Hendrix would play every night, and then he discovered Johnny Winter, and he was Johnny Winter's manager. And I met all three of them that night with Danny and Max's, and changed my and that was my life for the next several years. These were the coolest. They were all people I looked up to, and who for some reason decided I was an interesting guy to be around them.
Why do you think that? Why? What do you think about you interested them?
I don't know.
You must have some clue.
Young energy.
I think young.
Yeah, but
young,
there's lots of young people.
Well, but whatever. I got into the room, and it's like there's this line in that Dylan documentary, No Direction Home, where Dylan says, somehow I had gotten in when no one was looking, and there was nothing they could do to get me out once I was in. And I don't know how I got in, but once I was in, I was not leaving.
You're not leaving.
I was going to find a way of staying connected. So for several years, my social life was this group of people who hung out at Max's. Different. Lisa Robinson was one of them.
I know Lisa.
Now writes for Vanity Fair. A guy named Henry Edwards. And Steve Paul, and there was a woman named Lorraine Alterman, who was a New York Times critic, later married the actor Peter Boyle, and 15 or 20 of us, and we just thought we were the smartest, coolest people in the world. And it gave me this ridiculous, irrational self-confidence, because I was considered cool by those people, that everybody ought to think I was cool.
Right.
So by the time I meet Zeppelin, I've got this
Cred
irrational
within
cockiness
yourself, yeah.
based on an extremely small subculture that turned out not to be remotely as influential as I thought it was, but was enough
It's the
to
power.
get me into the game.
It's the power of self-talk.
Yeah.
That gave your
Yeah.
self-talk permission to go off the hinges, and then
so
manifest
So when
that
I
reality.
say that to Peter Grant, make me vice president, I figured, man,
Okay.
I can get in the back room at Max's. I'm like, please, I've met
I might
these
as well
drag-
be vice president.
I've met these drag queens. I'm like, I'm more than a mere publicist.
Yeah. I'm a cultural icon.
Yeah, like, and he was like, fine. What did he,
But it's the power of self-talk.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's like if you it's the fake it till you make it, or if you can the power of delusion in a
No
way,
question.
but it becomes not delusional.
Yeah. What did you do there?
It's really like hard to get that momentum going, though. But once you do, and
So what did I do where?
At Swan, as vice president. What was your
The job was mostly publicity.
Oh, still publicity.
still a
Okay.
publicity.
Right.
Publicity.
But
Vice president.
I had a broader set of things because I ended up Swan Song wasn't really a label; it was more of an imprint.
Yeah, because they were on Atlantic,
and the
right?
label was Atlantic.
Yeah.
And Atlantic just gave them this imprint. So I was the one that would go to Atlantic and meet with the promo people and the salespeople on behalf of the band because they were all in England. Peter was my boss, but he only came to America periodically. And they had one other executive named Steve Weiss, who was a lawyer. So all the negotiations, the money, the business deals, Steve Weiss controlled completely. I had nothing to do with that or didn't even know what the details of it were. But anything to do with dealing with the booking agencies or because they did sign some other acts. And again, this is a Zelig thing. So many lucky things happened. And one of the many lucky things that happened was that the first album released on Swan Song was Bad Company's first album, Bad Co.
Huge.
Which had a number one single, Can't Get Enough of Your Love, and a number one album. So now I'm the vice president of
And
a
you look
company
like
with
a
a number.
genius.
Yeah, I was just there.
Right.
I mean, we mailed it out. We
I
mailed.
put the stamp on.
I mean, we had these. Then in those days, you would physically mail out the records to the press. We mailed it out.
You must have good karma from a past life.
Thank you,
Something.
God.
Wow.
Something. So, was Peter Green an intimidating character to
Peter
work
Grant.
for? I mean, sorry, Peter Grant.
Peter Grant, great guitar player.
Yeah, Peter Green. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great guitar. But Peter Grant, was he intimidating?
Peter Grant could be very intimidating.
Because I heard that.
He did. He was good to me. He really was. I owe him so much, and I got to thank him. He passed away at least 15 years ago. We had, and I did have a phone conversation with him maybe a year before he died, where I really got to thank him, and he was so sweet about it. But he was good to me. I learned a lot from him. I learned how to be a manager from him.
Right.
It was the same way I learned how to be a publicist by watching Lee Salters. If you talk about what that idea of mentor, that overused word. I mean, Peter, I worked for him for 2.5 years, and his idea was fuck everybody else. All that matters is what the artist. We work for the artist. Don't suck up to the record company. Don't suck up to the concert promoters. Don't suck up to the media. It's all about what the band wants. That's what we care about. And I carry that attitude to this day when I think of, not with the swagger of Peter Grant. For one thing, I don't have anybody as big as Led Zeppelin. It's a little easier to swagger when you're representing Zeppelin than. But
you've been in that position before.
he was he was physically intimidating. I mean, first of all, he was 300 pounds. So just sitting next to him in a limo when the car took a left turn, he I'd have hundreds of pounds. He was just physically intimidating. He was definitely somebody that when he was angry was intimidating and would get into physical fights. Although I never saw him hit anybody.
Right.
There's no question in my mind he did from time to time. And, there's that documentary, The Song Remains the Same. There's some footage of Peter backstage yelling at somebody who had bootlegged Zeppelin T-shirts. And I was working for them there. I was at that show that was filmed for Song Remains the Same. That was at the Garden in 73.
That's amazing.
So he was, he could definitely be intimidating. And he could sometimes be very, very brilliant. And he also sometimes made mistakes, which again, the cocaine, and all that sort of a thing.
Exasperates.
But I was always worried about him being mad at me. I walked around in a constant state of anxiety about not wanting Peter to be mad at me. But he was mostly pretty nice to me. I got to say, I was really lucky that way. I owe him a lot, and he taught me a lot by example. And he liked me, and he put me in that position. He changed my life. I mean, to this day, that's my biggest calling card is that I work for Zeppelin. I mean, first time I met Nirvana,
really,
Dave Grohl wanted to hear Zeppelin stories.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, too, though, because you said you don't have an artist that big that you could warrant that kind of swagger, but you did manage Nirvana, who was arguably even bigger. in some respects.
Well, I mean, they were never as big in terms of the amount of money they made because they just didn't tour as much.
Right.
Because Kurt didn't like touring that much.
But cultural importance-wise.
Culture important-wise, they're on the A list.
Yeah.
Well, I carried Peter Grant. I wrote a book that came out earlier this year about working with Kurt called Serving the Servant,
Right.
Remembering Kurt Cobain. And in it, I kept thinking, what would Peter Grant do? You know, and how would he handle this? And I would often think about certain things about like Lollapalooza wanted Nirvana to be on, and to be fair, I mean, I had a partner in managing Nirvana named John Silva, who today is an incredibly successful manager, has the Foo Fighters, many other big bands. But in those days, I was like the 40-year-old veteran, and John was younger, and John knew the music and the culture much better and did a lot of the work. But I played my role, and I remember when they were offered Lollapalooza the first time. Talking with Kurt, and I said, look, Led Zeppelin wouldn't have done this. Led Zeppelin did their own shows.
Right.
You know, and my idea is that you're big enough. You create your own. If you want to do something like, you do your own thing.
Right.
And, I'm not saying Kurt did what he wanted to do for his own reasons, but they never did do Lollapalooza.
Right.
And I had nothing against Lollapalooza. I only wish I'd thought of Lollapalooza.
Right.
And
no, but
it's
that
an
makes
incredible
sense.
cultural thing. But for that particular band, I did think through the lens of how Peter Grant thought about Nirvana as is to create their own world, not to try to latch on to other people's worlds, you know.
Yeah, you mean how Peter Grant thought of Led Zeppelin?
Yeah, how Peter Grant thought of Zeppelin, you know,
right.
In certain ways. A totally different kind of band. I mean, Kurt had all the social consciousness that Zeppelin didn't have, and Zeppelin had a physical commitment to touring that Nirvana, that Kurt never had, and it was a different kind of music and a different time. But I think I was a much better manager, and I think to this day I'm a better manager because I work for Peter Grant. There's just no question about it.
Right. Mainly the whole thing of you're dedicated to the artist.
The paradigm, the mindset. You can't overplay your hand. You've got to also sometimes. You have to compromise because, like I said, very few artists have the clout commercially that Zeppelin or Nirvana had. Mm-hmm. But as a mindset of what the role is, understanding what the role is, and I think that if you talk to any of the British managers, that came along later on, that Tony Smith, who did Genesis, and Phil Collins, or Ed Bicknell, who did Dire Straits, or that whole next generation of British managers, they all will say they patted themselves after Peter Grant.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
They should have a Managers Hall of Fame.
I don't know who would go to it.
Yeah.
Other managers.
It's a small. You'd have to charge a lot for entrance.
Right. $3,000 a ticket. Yeah. So how did you go from Swan Song to then? What happened after that?
Well, I had a falling out in '76 with Peter, and
what was it over?
The Zeppelin vibe was getting a little darker and druggier, and it was, there were a couple of different things. One thing is there was a young artist that I wanted to manage named Mirabai, who never made it successfully, but I thought she was going to, be an important artist, and I was spending too much of my time on her. In retrospect, I mean, I don't blame Peter for firing me. In retrospect, and he said, look, you've either got to let her go or I have to let you go. And I was like, no one's going to tell me what to do. So that was the exact predicate. And there were some other disagreements we'd had having to do with the booking of the band, the Pretty Things, that I just not worth, and some bad company concert promoter decisions that I complained about. That in retrospect, I was totally overreaching and thinking my opinion should matter that much. Mm-hmm. But at the time, I was pretty jacked up on my own. What is that old expression from dope dealing? Getting high on my own supply.
Yeah.
Got my own supply of ego.
Yeah.
So I started my own PR company because I thought and because I had been Zeppelin's publicist, I got clients right away. And the first client I got was Kiss.
Wow.
I had known Bill O'Coin from the time he started with Kiss, and we'd stayed friends. And
what year is this?
76.
Okay, and how old were you?
26.
So this is like Kiss is like becoming like They're the huge.
Kiss
then,
had
too.
become again. They'd already become a big superstar,
Right.
And the record that they put out when I worked for them during that period of time was called "Rock and Roll Over." I don't remember what the songs were on it. And then somehow I met through a friend. I met a guy who worked for Jet Records, and Jet Records was the creation of a guy named Don Arden. Don Arden had been Peter Grant's boss. He was even more connected with British gangsters than Peter Grant was. And he had managed the Small Faces and the Animals, and at this time his big band was Electric Light Orchestra, ELO, and they were big. They had big hits, and he created a label around them called Jet Records. So they became a client, and then I had another old friend who's still a friend of mine and still alive, I'm happy to say, named Paul Fishkin, who was running Bearsville Records. That was Albert Grossman's label. Albert Grossman had been Dylan's manager at his peak, Janis Joplin's manager, had then created Bearsville Records, and their biggest act was Foghat, forgotten now, but they were a platinum band that could headline, sell 5,000 seats, and they had Todd Rundgren and some other people. So those were my clients, were first Kiss, and that only lasted a year or two because then Bill started his own in-house PR thing, and then Bearsville Records and Jet Records. And those became the nucleus of a PR company which had the imaginative name Danny Goldberg, Inc., which I started out of my apartment on 79th Street, and then enough business came and I was able to rent offices.
Right.
And I wanted to be a manager, but I couldn't get anyone to want me to be their manager. I was still in my 20s. I didn't really know anything except publicity. And there's a certain psychological attitude you've got to have to make people think you could be a manager. It's not just an age thing, but getting older did help me convey that. There are some very young people who are great managers, but for me, and I got my first management client during those years of the late 70s, a band called Mink DeVille. And incredible band, a guy named Willie DeVille. He passed away some years ago. He had a drug problem and all that stuff. But they didn't make it, but at least that kind of got me into the thing of, okay, I've managed an
I've
act.
heard of them, though.
Yeah, he died, but they had some great songs. There's a cult following still of some of Mink DeVille's songs. I'm very proud to have worked with them.
What's the thing that you were saying? There's an energy you have to give off to be a manager. What is that energy?
I think someone has to trust that you know something about the business and can guide them. It's some sort of a big brother kind of a role. I mean, even though as a manager you're working for the artist, I always say we don't manage them. We manage their career for them.
Yeah.
We manage for them. We don't manage them.
But those lines get blurred.
Those lines can get blurred
very easily.
And you still have to make, it's like being you still have to represent some kind of authority, at least within one part of their career.
Yeah. Well, I heard Kurt Cobain call you a second father in an interview.
Well, that was amazing that he said that.
On the John Savage interview.
John Savage.
That was a great fucking, excuse my French, interview. Or it's more like a pre-podcast, before podcast on YouTube of John Savage and Kurt Cobain.
I listened. I had not heard.
Didn't hear that?
I had seen the article years ago.
It's on YouTube.
But I hadn't heard it, and then when I was researching the book, I just wanted to hear Kurt's voice.
Yeah.
At some point, I got stuck writing, and I went on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I came across it and listened to it. And when I heard him say that, I just started crying. This is just like a year ago.
And that was after he said you weren't even managing him anymore, and he said that.
I know.
So that was a very sweet thing. I listened to it last night in preparation. Wow. Yeah. And when I got to that, I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, it blew my mind when I heard it. It's just, again, I had not heard his voice saying that until last year, exactly what you're saying on YouTube. Right. But Kurt was that way. He was so nice to me.
Yeah, but that is the it does become a family kind of thing when you are managed by people. It does, those lines do blur.
Yeah, they blur a little bit. There's a certain kind of a gravitas you need to have for people to have confidence in you, that you understand enough about them, number one, and number two, that you understand enough about the business that you can do something for them. And it's that perception. It's not always based in reality, but that perception is what makes somebody say, okay, fine, be my manager.
Right.
So
but that's a recurring
it took me a
theme.
while. It took me a while I never really got traction doing that until until I was well into my 30s is when I finally kind of found a tone and a posture that was actually able to build some management clients. But for the first several years, as a publicist, though, I could sell myself right away because I'd been Zeppelin's publicist. That's all I wanted to know. First time I met with Kiss, we were talking about their next record, and after about a half hour, Paul Stanley said, "Okay, fine. Now I want to talk about what's really important. Tell me what Jimmy and Robert are really like to work with."
Yeah.
So, that was a hell of a credential.
And what'd you tell him?
I don't remember, but
you don't.
Something that he didn't fire me, so it must have been okay. He's another nice guy, Paul Stanley.
Yeah. What was it like working with Paul and Gene?
I ended up at that time being closer to Gene because Gene was really the guy that was so into the imagery. I mean, the makeup I believe had been his idea. He was a media freak. And he was fun to work with, it was very, it was like you throw him the ball, he knew what to do with it, So it was fun. Again, after about a year, O'Coin wanted to get in-house PR, and I didn't want to work just for him, so we parted ways professionally. But I stayed in touch. I worked with Kiss a couple of other times in subsequent years on different projects in different ways. And I really respected the professionalism. They understood what they wanted to do. They didn't have any of the romance of trying to make art. It was all about business, success, but they did have this visceral connection to the idea of rock and roll.
It's kind of the Andy Warhol thing, because by accident, then they made great rock and roll music. I mean? Like you say, they didn't say we're artists first and foremost. We're businessmen. We're like making this thing. But Andy Warhol was into the art of making money and then made great art.
But he also was an artist.
Right.
That's exactly right. No, they were a good rock band. They weren't
a great one.
Yeah,
I think.
So
there's great rock and roll songs.
And they reinvented the idea of a live show.
Yeah.
At that time, they were really more theatrical than anyone else was at that moment. A lot of things that have now become kind of cliches, like fireworks or fire going off or different things. But they were on the cutting edge of bringing theatricality to hard rock, and they're a big band, legendary band for a reason. They entertained people and touched people. So again, I didn't know them as well as some of the other people I work with, but I liked them. I like Gene. I'm a little bummed out the last. Gene's like a Trump supporter.
Is he?
Which kind of bums. Full on, I think.
Is he really? Well, but a lot of people are on The Apprentice.
No. Gene visited the White House, did a briefing at the Defense Department. After 9/11, Gene started spouting more right-wing things for whatever reasons, and God bless him. His parents were Holocaust survivors. I met his mother many times, Florence. She was a doting Jewish mother, and something in his head. I don't think he was ever a liberal, but he became a more owning, being a kind of a right winger, and it's harder for me to deal with in the Trump era. Although we all need as human beings to respect people we disagree with.
Well, that seems to gone away, is respecting people that you disagree with. That part is. What are your thoughts on that? Like the sort of antagonism between the left and the right.
It's trying to get into the spiritual frame of mind is the best frame for it. Ram Dass, who's politically, he's never talked much about politics, but he's a liberal, votes Democrat, like started talking years ago during the Gulf War period with George W. Bush of you have to see the soul of people and not just their roles. And he would say, my guru told me to love everybody. He used to say, and the hardest challenge was Republicans, but he's committed to being a spiritual being. And he has a puja table with different, his guru and different saints and everything. And then he would always put a John Boehner or W on his puja table just to remind himself, I have to love the challenge is to love the hardest person to love, not the easiest person, And I think he has Trump on his puja table now too. And you just have to see it's all part of one God. knows more than me. I don't understand why the world is the way it is. I don't know why they're suffering. I can't explain it. It's not from my mortal mind to explain the whole universe.
Yeah.
But the idea of trying to love everybody to the extent you can is works for me. Dr. King said the same thing.
Yeah.
And he was unwavering in disagreeing with people,
right?
If they were racists or warmongers or things like that. But he would always aspire to love them, and I think it's aspirational. It's hard to actually live that way and be that way, but it's the best aspirational place to go, and to try to also in this world. People are operating under totally two different sets of reality. Like I remember during the Gulf War, they did a poll of everybody in the country. Do you think Iraq attacked us on 9/11? And I think, 30% said yes. And then did a poll just to people who watched Fox News, and like 65% said yes, because they were told that. So. Yeah. People are, and I used to say, if I thought they had attacked us on 9/11, I might have felt differently about that war. I don't know. I'm a pacifist by nature. I don't like wars, but a very different thing if they had actually attacked us on 9/11 as opposed to the fact that they had absolutely nothing to do with it. Yeah. And so people are operating with different information.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not reading what we're reading. They don't have the same experiences, and you have to just go back to try to see the commonness of the humanity and not based on but there's so much of a market like for polarization. If you want power or money, it's a good business to be in, the polarizing business. Fox makes a lot of money, and there are people on the left who, all the left-wing groups that I support, like the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, they raised more money after Trump became president than at any time in their history.
Yeah.
So polarization can pay off. That's the bummer about it.
Yeah. What do you think about the deplatformings and all that kind of stuff going on? Does any of that disturb you?
I don't really understand it that much. I come out of a free speech sensibility.
That's where you came into.
I was an ACLU officer, the ACLU board member. I was against any, when Tipper Gore was criticizing rock lyrics and rap lyrics, I defended free speech, and I do believe in the ideal of free speech. But even the most extreme civil libertarian position recognized that there were certain kinds of speech that are inappropriate, like, for example, slander or threatening to kill somebody.
Of course.
So
I
think that
YouTube's
in an era where
deplatforming like health food channels now at this point, stuff
like
that.
I haven't studied it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a very unsettling.
It's like, where do you draw the line?
I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows, and I don't know where to draw the line. I mean, I think the idea of completely lying in a way, even that phrase hate speech, I think different people can use it in different ways.
Right.
But I do think that that something's out of control at the point that it's damaging the whole society. The level of just completely lying about people. I mean, for Facebook to say it's okay to run an ad saying that Joe Biden took $1 billion bribe, and they know absolutely that's not true. But their position is, hey, it's not for us to decide if the Republicans want to buy these ads. It's okay. That doesn't feel right to me.
No, that doesn't feel right. But neither does deplatforming, like, alternative modes of healing and stuff.
No,
like
I agree with you.
That part disturbs me.
No, I
where
think
I'm
there's
just
extremes.
Like,
I think there's got to be a middle ground. I don't know how to articulate or define it, nor have I studied it enough to be an intelligent person to talk about it. But there's got to be some new way of thinking about it, and either extreme approach isn't good. You don't want to have some uptight board of committee narrowing and muting and limiting free expression, nor can you have just sociopathic liars running the world. So there's got to be some
middle
standards, some middle ground, some credentialing. I don't know how you do it. I hope somebody's thinking about it.
I don't think anybody is.
I think there are people thinking about it.
I think there are people
I don't know whether they have enough of an influence on Google and Facebook I think over the nenext decade it'll shake out. I mean, you look at American history. There's been a lot of weird periods. This is not the first.
That's true.
Insane time. There were there were witch burnings.
Right.
Okay, let's just start with that. Slavery, genocide of Native Americans, McCarthyism.
No, we can survive.
We've been lied into more than one war.
I believe we can survive this.
Yeah. So it's not like this country was just so perfect until Donald Trump came along.
Yeah, exactly.
Not.
Right. I agree with you there. Who do you like now? I mean, you don't have to say.
I mean, I'll say who I'm going to vote for. I'm going to vote for Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, okay.
I like her. I don't know that she's going to win.
What about Tulsi? What's her name? Tulsi.
I'm not a fan of hers.
You're not a fan?
I don't really quite. There's something about her that makes me a little uncomfortable. I mean, I like certain positions she takes, her sort of anti-intervention posture. I'm an anti-interventionist. I'm a believer in lowering the defense budget, anti-imperialist. That part of her I like. I don't really understand what else she stands for. Mm-hmm. And her general sort of anger at everybody doesn't feel right to me as a national leader. I mean, I think she's an interesting character, but I'm not for her for president of the United States.
Okay. Yeah, so you like Elizabeth Warren?
I like Elizabeth Warren. I also like Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
I'll definitely support whoever gets the nomination, no matter who it is. If any Democrat to me, I'll support enthusiastically.
Yeah.
But my politics veer to what you would call more to the left, social democratic. I do believe the wealth imbalance is a huge problem, and I identify with the policy positions of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. I don't know if either of them will get the nomination, though. And if they don't, then I'll support whoever does.
Right on. Well, so where did you, like, veering back to the music stuff, where did you go after, how did you get on Atlantic Records?
I had, so when I started the PR company, I told you one of my clients was Bearsville Records.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul Fishkin ran Bearsville for Albert. And at some point in the late 70s, early 80s, but I think it was the end of I get mixed up with these years now. Yikes. Anyway, at some point, he starts dating Stevie Nicks. When Fleetwood Mac was at their peak of popularity, Rumors was the biggest album in history at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever year Rumors came out, he's dating Stevie Nicks. And he wanted me to meet her, and I was so excited to meet Stevie Nicks. And we discovered very quickly, he explained to me that she wasn't signed to a record company as a solo artist. Now, to just go back, Fleetwood Mac had been around for many, many years, and they kept changing guitar players. They had Peter Green for a while, we mentioned before, a guy named Bob Welch for a while, and then they reach out to Lindsey Buckingham, and Lindsey Buckingham says, look, if I'm going to be in the band, my girlfriend's got to be in the band too.
Mm-hmm.
We have a duo together. They had this record, Buckingham Nicks. So they had no idea. They didn't even want Stevie Nicks. They just took her to get Lindsey. And Warner Brothers was the label. They were this huge label. They had, one of the biggest major record companies. So Fleetwood Mac was not a particularly important artist to them. They had made 6 or 7 records. They would always sell like 150,000 records at a time when platinum was 1 million. But Warner's had this habit of not dropping bands. And so usually when a label would sign a band, they would have what was called leaving member clauses for each member of the band. So if Robert Plant, when Led Zeppelin broke up, Robert Plant still, I think, had some obligation to Atlantic initially, and so on. But because Fleetwood Mac had so many different members, no one at Warner's thought it was worth signing leaving members clauses to the latest members of Fleetwood Mac. Who cares who's in Fleetwood Mac? So the first record that Stevie and Lindsey are in, they go from selling 150,000 to 4 million because she wrote this song called Rhiannon.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a gigantic hit. The second record with the two of them is Rumors, which ends up selling like 20 million or something. It was at that time literally the biggest album in history. It was #1 for 39 weeks in a row.
Mm-hmm.
And she wrote the biggest hit on that, also a song called Dreams. And so by this time, she had no reason to sign anything. Now she's one of the lead singers and songwriters of the biggest band in the world. And in fact, her song, there were 3 different writers and singers in Fleetwood Mac: Lindsay, Stevie, and Christine McVie. But Stevie's had the biggest hits. Dreams and Rhiannon, and later Sarah, Landslide, Gold Dust Woman. These were literally the biggest ones. And Paul explained to me she'd become frustrated because they wouldn't include enough of her songs on the record. There were all these arguments in multi-writer groups, who's going to get more songs for the publishing revenue. And she had this song called Silver Springs that they wouldn't put on Rumors, and it really infuriated her. And she was looking for other outlets. So I was like so excited. I just started going. That's when I started going to L.A. just to hang out with Stevie Nicks. I got her home number, and she'd invite me over. And she had this whole entourage of people that liked her. And
Did you have a crush on her?
Well, it was unrequited.
Everybody did.
My best friend had an affair with her. It wasn't like a possibility, nor do I have any reason to believe she was interested in me. But I was like,
is that you and her?
Yeah, that's me and Stevie. Yeah.
Oh man,
you look good there.
Yeah, I was younger then.
You look like Don Johnson.
Yeah.
That's a good shot.
Yeah.
We got to take a picture of that.
I'll put that in the video.
So after different ideas of Stevie projects, we come up with the idea of starting a label, and that she should make solo records, and she goes for it, and we created something called Modern Records. And we ended up doing the Modern Records. We needed funding for it, and we talked to all the big companies. And Doug Morris had just gotten into a position at Atlantic where he was running a division of Atlantic called Atco and the Custom Labels. He wasn't president of Atlantic yet. And he got the company to invest X millions of dollars for our company. So now I'm in business with Doug Morris. And the first record that came out on Modern was Belladonna by Stevie Nicks. It went to #1. So that's how I got to know Doug Morris. And some years later, after Nirvana, I stayed in touch with Doug over the years, do different things with Atlantic, sometimes with other labels, but always stayed in touch with him. He was like a contact that I had, and he liked me. And then after Atlantic, I got hot in the late '80s, early '90s as a manager. First, Bonnie Raitt won the Grammy for Album of the Year, and then the next year we had Nirvana. And suddenly I'm after 20 years of trying to be taken seriously in the business, in my early 40s, now I'm like a hot manager because I had these two big things that were kind of different genres.
Yeah.
And Doug at that point was looking for an executive to become president of Atlantic. He wanted to move up in the hierarchy. So he offered me a job to be senior VP of Atlantic for the West Coast. And I was pretty sure if I did a good job, there was a good chance I could become president of Atlantic because I kind of knew where he wanted to go. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
So, that's
how similar was that job to the ones you had already learned, publicity and management?
Well, there were some similarities and some differences. The similarities were being able to talk to artists and get their confidence, and having a sense of marketing and the imaging. That part was similar, and the trying to be a team builder and get along with people. But there was a whole other dimension in corporations of sort of understanding the financial requirements of a corporation and the politics of different levels of the corporation that I never really mastered, which is why I only spent 6 years at major labels. But I had enough hits that I was able to spend 6 years in those big jobs, and I made more money in those 6 years than I did any other time before or after.
And were you still a manager while you were doing that?
Well, I wasn't much of a when I first went to Atlantic, Kurt was still alive.
Right.
And because of the way that things had developed in the relationships of the people around Nirvana, I developed this personal relationship with him that was unique among the business people in his life. And the main reason for that was that I got along with Courtney, who was his wife, and a lot of other people. When he first fell in love with her, people didn't think it was going to last and weren't particularly nice to her. I just sort of, that was an advantage of being older.
Yeah.
There were advantages of being younger when I was younger, but the advantage of then I was older than the other people that were around the band in their 20s. And I just knew he was in love with her. I knew it wasn't some groupie or anything like that. I just got it right away. So by this time, after Nevermind was out, I was really attracted to the idea of leaving management and working for a big company. First of all, I had a sense of the fragility of Nirvana commercially because I realized Kurt had some problems. Secondly, I'd had my first kid. My daughter, Katie, was born in 1990, so she's 1 or 2 years old. And being a manager, you're traveling a lot, and you know, when I went to work for Atlantic, I had weekends. It was like, it was
unbelievable.
You know, I didn't have to personally deal with the payroll of a small business. So in terms of the amount of physical time it took, it was easier than being a manager. But there were things involved with trying to be a good executive that were completely new to me. I'd never studied finance. I'd never studied law. I had never been in a corporation. And I made quite a few mistakes, although I worked for two corporations. First, Warner Music, which was Atlantic and Warner Brothers, and then Polygram and Mercury. And again, because of hits kept me through. But you know, there were things that I was good at and things I wasn't good at.
What mistakes did you make?
Well, losing my temper at the wrong people at the wrong time, having
burning
my
some
feelings hurt,
bridges.
investing my ego in minor issues, you know, being overly, you know, not always respectful enough of the budgetary needs of a company, and having this Max's Kansas City notion that being cool was more important than it actually is. It's a funny thing, this line of work. So the writing has been great for my head these last two books. I've got to think of a new book I'm going to work on over the holidays, see if I can sell it. And
what's the idea?
the idea in general, the arena is the connection between entertainment and politics in the Trump era. Because so many artists, performers, comedians, singers, I mean, it's such an intense statement by so much of the creative community, unprecedented, way more than during the Vietnam era. You know, from Taylor Swift to Bette Midler to, you know, and I'm fascinated by that kind of other definition of America through a cultural lens instead of just the narrow definition of what pollsters are. So I have this incoherent idea that I'm trying to make coherent, but it's an arena that I know some about and that I care about. So I'll see if I can pull it off. You know, I did a piece for The Nation a couple of weeks ago about Kathy Griffin that was just an attempt, because she did this special on that's on Amazon about, you know, she had this drama where, I don't know her, I just did a phone interview with her and wrote the story.
The drama with the head thing?
With the head, and then she's like, all her shows were canceled, and the WME dropped her, and CNN fired her, and the FBI investigated her for conspiracy to assassinate the president.
That's ridiculous.
Insane.
Yeah.
And so she did this comedy special about that, and then she overcame it, and she did an international tour and filmed it and made this thing. And I just think it's an interesting story, and she kind of became an interesting lens because she comes out of reality television. You know, she knew Trump from that world,
right?
And she speaks the language of the Kardashians. You know, in a way. So I thought it's just a 1,000-word piece. It's not like a book about Kathy, but I think there's maybe 50 mosaic pieces like that I might be able to have something interesting to say about it all, but I might not. It's, you know, it's creative. You know how it is. Not every song you write ends up being great.
How do you focus yourself to write a book? Do you have like okay, I'm going to write in the mornings? Do you do morning pages? What do you do? What's your process when you decide to do it?
Usually I spend the first half of the day procrastinating.
Good to hear.
And then at a certain point in the afternoon, I'm in such a self-hatred
that you just have to.
That I just have to.
Right.
That's my.
I love that. That's good. That gives
my
me
process.
Hope. That's not bad.
You know. And
is writing something you do all the time, or is it specific?
I try to do it all the time, because if I stop doing it, it's very hard to start again.
It's hard to get back. It
takes me weeks. So it's that old cliche. I try to keep the muscle alive, and I'm struggling with that now. But I try to write something every day, even if it's just for 15 minutes, just to not lose touch with the idea of it. Finishing a book, I have no problem with. Then I have a goal, and I have a plan, and I can budget out 2-3 hours. About 2-3 hours is about as much as I can concentrate a day usually, unless it's right near a deadline. But starting one is like existential terror, because you know, a lot of times I think I have an idea and it's a road to nowhere. But it's been good for my head doing the writing, and it's kind of redefined myself to myself, and I'm. You know, the two books were real publishers, real reviews, New York Times, Washington Post, London. The Kurt book, because of him, it's translated into like 12 other languages. There's a Russian version, a Polish version, Brazil,
There's a
Portuguese,
huge fascination with them. Still.
Spanish, German, French. So that's been a fun once in a lifetime. I don't have another subject like Kurt Cobain,
right?
But that's the most recent one, and that was the most successful one so far. So hopefully I can keep doing it. But it's a constant struggle because it's so easy. I mean, you've been so amazing. The amount of creative things you've done. I mean, no matter whether you were screwed up or healthy, you're always being creative. Hundreds and hundreds of songs and paintings, and you have a unique channel. I don't have that. I have to just find a little channel and try to manifest it. But
I have
it
writing
feels good
ambitions too, and
Yeah.
I deal with that same procrastination and the same like right now I've like lost the muscle memory of writing, and I've had it before, and I know how good that feels when you're in the zone of the flow of it.
No, exactly. And I love rewriting. That's I mean, to me the biggest part of writing is rewriting. You have the general idea, and then actually it's like refining it and getting rid of the redundant sentences and getting rid of the stupid words and trying to find a more conversational way of saying things and to bring it to life. But it's starting it is very, very hard. My wife Karen has written a couple of books, and when she was working on her last book, she was just struggling with it. She does like the book about the Justice Department called Rogue Justice was her most recent one, and she was like bitching and moaning about it, and her daughter just said, "Mom, just write a bad book."
That's so liberating.
And it was
what a genius. How
Right?
old's that person?
It's like she's 30 now.
Okay, so she's
But that was the best advice ever.
That is the best advice to anyone doing any creative thing.
Right.
Is give yourself permission for it to be bad.
Right.
Even like starting this podcast, we didn't know what the fuck we were doing.
We didn't do a bad job.
But it's like you have to just go for it and just do it. Even like coming in to interview you, I'm like, because I know you a little bit. And,
I got to say, it meant so much to me when Ehud said you wanted to do this.
Oh, yeah.
Because I've always wanted to reconnect, and this is probably the longest conversation we've ever had.
Yeah.
So I very much appreciate that you wanted to do it.
Yeah, no, I respect you a great deal, and enjoyed working with you. It's like, and I tell people like, Danny used to manage me, and we ended, but we're still friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's always been my theory behind us.
Yeah. No, most of the people, 90% of the people I used to work with, I still feel friends with. There's a couple where the feelings are still not that great,
went
but
out.
90%.
It happens.
Yeah.
Shit happens.
Shit happens, and you're never going to get to 100%. But anyway, so what else?
But so writing about the Kurt Cobain thing,
Yeah.
like that's brought up a bunch of wild controversy too, like around his death and stuff like that. I mean, what's your feeling and take on all that stuff?
Well,
I mean,
I had because I knew him and I was there
Right.
for a lot of it. I mean, I didn't take drugs with him. I didn't play music with him, and I wasn't
You were a
the
father
punk rock
figure.
generation. But it was nice that he said that in an interview. But I looked at it more of as a big brother. Not,
Okay.
he was smarter than me, more talented than me. There's no question about that. But in certain areas, I could be of help to him. Psychologically, he had zero relationship with his own father.
Right.
I only met his father once at the funeral. So I'm happy to talk about him, but I knew what I thought because I was there. It was a challenging of putting it into a book form, and I spoke to around 40 other people, Courtney and Chris Novoselic, as well as Scott Litt and a couple of the record producers, people at the label, the people who knew him when I knew him. I wasn't trying to do a biography of Kurt. I didn't do his childhood.
the last 3 years of his life.
Last 3 years of his life when I worked with him, and that helped me to bring it to life and to flesh it out. But I knew what I thought about the so-called controversies when I started out, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. But his death, I mean, he killed himself.
Yeah.
He was prone to depression. He was on again, off again junkie. He liked guns. We prayed that it wouldn't happen, and unfortunately it did. He was in and out of rehab many times, and everybody around him tried to introduce him to counselors and get him into 12 steps. He didn't like 12 steps. It's like, I tell you, 12 steps has saved the lives of many people very, very, very close to me.
Yeah.
And I admire it so much. And I think that guy was kind of an American saint, Bill Wilson. But it's not for everybody.
Right.
And there's not a great plan B.
No.
If people aren't into that, and John Coltrane just somehow apparently kicked heroin. He went into a room and did it cold turkey and came out and was John Coltrane until he died of cancer a few years later. And there are people who do that, and most people who do it have a 12-step component. And it's tough if people aren't into 12 steps. That what do you tell them to do? Pray, get a shrink. You just hope that they find some reason not to kill themselves.
Yeah,
but a lot of people do kill themselves, and nobody knows why. I mean, there's psychiatrists and rabbis and priests and philosophers who've been trying to figure this out. And meanwhile, every year, 60 or 70,000 Americans kill themselves, most of them men, half of them with guns.
Yeah, it's terrible.
You know.
Yeah, I recommend 12-step to people too.
Yeah.
Because it's like, and especially like if you decide to do it, don't psych yourself out with thinking you have to be sober forever. Like, go in for a week.
Right.
Stop drinking for a week or stop taking drugs for a
Absolutely.
week.
Absolutely.
Go every day, and at the end of that week, then see where you're at. Because addiction
Correct.
is like a cycle, and if you can grace breaks the cycle, and if you can come out of it, but you don't control grace. That's the thing about grace, is it comes when it comes, but you can kind of like roll with it when it comes, you know, and 12-step can help facilitate that. No end.
That's as well put as I've ever heard it. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Bill Wilson, funnily enough, was kind of into LSD.
I know.
Which is interesting.
No, I know.
Because the big, heavy, big book thumpers would like frown against that, but he was seriously into that.
Apparently, Steve Earle, who I've worked with we just passed 20 years earlier this year together, and now he's on a management client. First was on a label I had, and he's working on a memoir. And a part of it is, you know, he's been very publicly talked about that he's in the program, so I'm not busting his anonymity.
Right.
He's talked about it for years, and he's researched a lot about just what you were talking about.
The LSD
it's
aspect.
part of what he's writing about. He's really tried to learn everything he can about Bill Wilson because he feels so grateful, you know, for that concept.
Yeah. Has he ever gone to Akron, where it all started?
I don't think
That's
so.
where I'm from.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I'm from the homeland.
Huh, I didn't know
Which
that.
is kind of a special place.
And that's the same place Chrissy Hyde is from?
Yeah, and the Black Keys. We all went to
Yeah.
the same high school.
Wow.
Yeah, and LeBron James.
Wow.
It's from Akron.
Whoa.
Yeah. So look out.
Yeah. Very cool.
But have you ever considered microdosing mushrooms or anything like that? Have you ever tried that?
I haven't tried it. I haven't ruled it out.
It's real interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, talking about like taking a small
Yeah,
piece, you don't even barely feel it. It just
Yeah.
elevates your perception to a degree.
I'm open to it.
Try that with writing.
Yeah, a lot of my friends are into it. It's an off mic conversation.
Yeah, it's becoming legal.
Yeah,
though,
no, it's
everywhere.
becoming legal. I know in San
and
Francisco.
Harvard is
and
doing studies
Yeah,
on it now.
yeah.
It's like it's
50
becoming
years later.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm open to it. I haven't done it, but I a number of my friends are into it, and I'm open to it.
Yeah, well, there's so much we can cover, but there's like not that much time.
I know.
So it's like because we've got there's Artemis and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Do you have any final questions for Danny? We gotta let him go.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was just curious. I was in the office when you were not here. There's that letter on the wall that Kurt wrote to Juliana.
Yeah, yeah.
And in it he says, you could explain what's behind it, but he says, as long as I've known Danny Goldberg, he's a great guy. As long as he's in our life, we'll be okay.
No, it's very sweet. That's the same period of time probably when he did that interview with John Savage, because I was at Atlantic by then. What happened is, you had asked me earlier, is I when I went to work for Atlantic, my deal with the company was that I could continue to be a co-manager of Nirvana. Mm-hmm. And that was in everybody's interest. That was my whole brand, was I was the Nirvana guy. That's what they were buying. Mm-hmm. You know, at that time we was trying to sign artists that were in that then commercial genre. It was turned out to be a brief period, but
yeah.
And the relationship with Kurt. So I continued to play that role in the business stuff for him. When he had certain issues, he just would want to talk to me about it. But and then when I was at Atlantic, I was always thinking of, I wanted to sign things that he thought were cool. That's why I signed the Melvins, and he produced the Melvins record. And I didn't know he would be into. So Juliana, Hatfield was on a label called Mammoth, one of the first deals. My job was to bring, alternative rock to Atlantic. They had the Lemonheads. They had a couple of bands in that lane, but they were behind Geffen and Warner Brothers in the alternative rock space, and that was kind of my first task. And so I bought a label called Mammoth Records that had Juliana on it, and she put out this album, and she had a song called Nirvana on the record because she loved them so much, and then she had this great song called My Sister, which was kind of the MTV song. And so I didn't know any, and so then after he died, Juliana shared with me a fax that Kurt had sent her. There was no internet. Internet was just starting. So the big thing was faxes. Kurt loved faxing because he didn't want to wait for a letter to be delivered, and there was nobody was doing email yet. So there's a lot of Kurt faxes in his own handwriting, and he sent her one because she had come to see a show of his, and he felt bad that he hadn't been nice enough. This guy was the sweetest guy in the world. His darkness was all interdirected. He couldn't have been more considerate and sweet to other people. So it bothered him that he had been just said hi and hadn't schmoozed her or made her feel good. So he sent her this fax, and in it he mentioned he knew that her record was coming out via Atlantic that I was by then running or involved with. I forget whether I'd president yet or still just the A&R dude. And he said a couple of nice sentences about me, and she said, "I thought you'd want to see this." So, after he died, it obviously loomed larger as a thing, as an artifact of him, So I didn't know at the time that he had written it, but after he died, she sent that to me, and I've always treasured it because it's such a nice of him to have said that about me in writing. And it's not like he told me he did it. It was just it's the same as the John Savage thing. He didn't say, "Hey man, I just said I said this thing to John." It was just that was his thing about me, and
he had a lot
I
of
can't
love
thank
for
him
you.
enough. I mean, he did a lot more for me than I did for him, but I was there for him any way I could be that I knew of consciously, and I hope the book reflects and shines a light on his creative side, his humor, his warmth. You can't deny his dark side. He killed himself.
Yeah, and his music was full of that darkness too.
Yeah, I don't sugarcoat that, but it's like I try to shine the light more on that side of him than I think some of the other media about him does. And that was kind of the idea of the book, was to just kind of a little more of a romanticized, just focus on his greatness. Like I always say, look, Jimi Hendrix killed himself. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but he died the same age. Yeah. By his own hand. It was heroin instead of a gun. But when I think of Hendrix, I think of his guitar solos. Yeah. I don't think of his death. Yeah. Right. And I think when a lot of fans of Nirvana, I think they think of those Unplugged and In Utero and Come As You Are and Smells Like Teen Spirit and All Apologies and his cover of the Bowie song, Man Who Sold the World, and that voice,
incredible voice.
And I mean, to talk to the engineers who made the records, I talked to Butch Vig, who did Nevermind, and Scott Litt, who remixed In Utero and who did Unplugged. He says, we did nothing. That was how he sounded. Yeah. And the sound man too. I talked to who was their sound man for the first 80% of their crew was a guy named Craig Montgomery. He ended up getting fired 6 months before Kurt died, but he did like hundreds and hundreds of shows. He says, my job was to make sure people could hear him sing. Right. That was the whole job. It was like people, all of his other qualities were so amazing as a songwriter, producer, a conceptualizer of rock, artist, activist, supporter of other artists. But on top of that, and he was a very good guitar player. He was the lead guitar player of Nirvana.
He was great. Great guitar player, great solos.
But if he only sang, he would have been a star just as a singer.
Yeah, for sure.
And his voice smooth. So I just want to shine a light on the side of him that I knew. It was not the only side of him, and there's 50 different versions of Kurt. He was a complicated guy, but I tried to just remember him as best I could with the help of the people I worked with at the time, and I loved him. I really loved him. Mm-hmm. What a guy.
I love the title of it too. The book.
Oh, thanks. Serving the Servant.
How'd you come up with that? I mean, I know he's got the song.
Well, you know
Serve the
how it is.
Servants.
I mean, trying to think of a good title.
Yeah.
And I just was in a panic. What's the title? I had other working titles that I knew weren't good, and then I figured, well, song titles are always good. My previous book, I ripped off a song title, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and the Happy Idea. So I just went through. I'm going through all the songs. I see Serving the Servant, Serve the Servants, which is the lead track on In Utero. And I thought I could turn into Serving the Servant, which was both an homage to that song.
Yeah.
I love In Utero. It's my favorite Nirvana
It's my
record.
favorite too.
And I also thought, and I put this in the book, I said, that he was the servant of a muse that only he could hear, but that he could then translate so millions of people could hear it. And then people who worked for him, our job was to try to serve him. I mean, he was the genius. He did everything in Nirvana. No disrespect. Obviously, Dave Grohl's incredibly talented. Chris Novoselic, talented and one of the great human beings ever. But Kurt wrote the lyrics and the music, lead guitar player and the lead singer, storyboarded all the videos, designed the album covers, and made every single decision.
Yeah.
So, I'm just saying he was that guy, and everybody else's job. And I think Chris, would say the same thing. He knew him from high school. Was how do you help him do his thing? And to me, it kind of defined what the idea was of being a manager. So
right.
And I thought, and I couldn't think of a better title. Its titles are.
It's hard.
But
you get a good one.
But you get a good one. It's so helpful.
Yeah. Another interesting thing on that John Savage interview was him saying, like, it was a foreshadowing because he said, I'd like to do something where me and Dave switch places. He says that in the interview.
He told me.
So that was interesting because I was like, damn, he saw what Dave Grohl was capable of.
Listen, man, I wish I had seen it. I always joke, if I had known how talented Dave Grohl was, I would have hung out with him a lot more. I was so obsessed with the singer. That's my thing, is hang out with the singer and songwriter. That was a bit of a mistake. But Kurt told me he was a great singer.
Yeah.
Kurt said, you don't understand, I hear him singing harmony. He's great. And I didn't know what Kurt meant until later.
Right.
But Kurt knew. No, listen, he had his problems.
Yeah.
Obviously. But he was one of the smartest in the rock world, one of the greats. He was on that short list with Dylan, Springsteen, Lennon.
Yeah.
He's on that, Bob Marley. He's on that list. He was a fucking real life genius.
I mean, he got me to write songs.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. That's when I was a bass player, and then Nirvana came out, and I was like, holy shit. Yeah. I mean, one of my biggest influences.
Oh, wow. We never talked about that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, he was the real deal. Anyway, we're good. I hate to cut it off, but I think
thanks for doing this,
Yes.
Danny.
Thank you for
really, really appreciate it.
I'll wrap this up. Thank you.
Hi, this is Joseph Arthur. Thanks for checking out Come to Where I'm From. Please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/come-to-where-I'm-from. We are an independent podcast, and any contributions you can make are greatly appreciated.